What's up, everybody? Thank you for joining us this afternoon here at the Marin County Free Library. My name is Danny Le. I am a librarian here at the Studios Library in Novato, City, Novato. But we are here on April 30th to join us with one of my inspirations and inspiring creators of amazing literature and thought-provoking essays in the world of culture and politics. We are here with Pulitzer Prize winning author of The Sympathizer, a MacArthur Fellow, a celebrated professor. I hear he's a dope dad and husband, so I think, and a connoisseur of great spirits and beverages, amongst many other accolades. Let's give a warm virtual welcome to Viet Thanh Nguyen.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Danny. Thanks so much for having me here.
What's up, my man? How you doing?
I am fine. It's April 30th. It's the National Day of, I guess, mourning for Vietnamese Americans, Vietnamese refugees who have fled from Saigon. So Vietnamese Americans are in high demand for speaking engagements today. You're number 2 out of 4.
I know. I've foregone asking any other Vietnamese people because I saw that they had 20 other engagements. I was like, you know what? I have Viet. I'm fine. This is good. That's all I need. Getting started with the interview, I want to interview in a way where it's pretty unique to both of us, because if anybody else wants other, critiques on culture in America, they can YouTube those talks. But we have a lot in common. We grew up in San Jose. I'm still in San Jose. And we also had parents who owned stores. So my family owned convenience stores and gas stations since I came here from Oklahoma in '88. And that affected me greatly because, one, I couldn't escape working for them. It was free labor. So stocking and, working the register was something that I had to do. It was a part of my life. So I didn't have the general upbringing as most other children my age. So what was it like growing up, one, in San Jose, but also working or being a part of your family's small business entrepreneurial goals?
Well, I came to San Jose in 1978 from Harrisburg, where we had first lived from 75 to 78. Then we came, and then, it's like my parents heard from a friend in San Jose, hey, the weather is good, the benefits are good, the economy is good. And so we left Harrisburg to come to San Jose. Thank God, that we made that move, because I've been back to Harrisburg since. Nothing's happening in Harrisburg, even though it's the capital of Pennsylvania. So anyway, came to San Jose in '78. My parents opened perhaps the second Vietnamese grocery store in the city, so far as I know, and it was on Santa Clara Street downtown. And if you're familiar with that area, basically, if you go there today, City Hall is literally right across the street from where my parents' store used to be. And right now, what's being built there on my parents' store is a gigantic condominium complex. We can get into all of that later. But from '78 to about '88, my parents ran this grocery store during a kind of a transitional period in San Jose history, because now, San Jose is known as being, the heart of the Silicon Valley, and there's, downtown is kind of glossy with a lot of developments and stuff. '78, nobody wanted to be downtown except for the Vietnamese refugees who had come to town and who needed business opportunities. That's what my parents did. Unlike you, I was in the center of the Vietnamese ethnic economy because it was catering specifically to Vietnamese people. But unlike you also, I didn't have to work in the store very often. I think my parents did not want me or my brother. My brother was 7 years older. They didn't want us to do what they did or were doing, So the emphasis was all on education. Occasionally, we were called in to help out. So I did do some of the stocking work that you're talking about and all that. But mostly they left us alone. So I rarely had to go to the store. But I was familiar with it. I would visit. I'll get free candy, that kind of thing. So that was one of the benefits of owning a grocery store. There was no limit on the kinds of candies and treats that we had. But it was a hard existence to run a grocery store. My parents were working 12 to 14-hour days almost every day of the year. It's a violent place. They got shot there. There was a lot of fear in the newly established Vietnamese American community in the 70s and 80s around violence, because a lot of gang violence was taking place, and Vietnamese gangs were targeting Vietnamese people, and so all of that was going on. It was very, very difficult time for the entire community, but also for my family too.
I think during that time, and especially I think the tail end of where your family owned that business, I remember coming to San Jose and, you know, one, I'm trying to acclimate to my surroundings as a child with more, looking at more diverse community members. But when understanding my own Vietnamese community, the idea of Vietnamese gangs, or, you know, and it was something new to me. Gangs in general, right? You know, as far as I knew, it was something we watched on TV happen, but that was something I had to kind of, you know, understand that I'm no longer in Kansas or Oklahoma, you know? So, but it was something that I identified, you know, in San Jose, and I was like, all right, well, this is something that I had to get to work on myself, especially being Vietnamese as well. So, did you have a creative inkling as a child, you know, in terms of writing? Was that something that you wanted to do? And how did your parents think about, you know, what you wanted to pursue when you went to college, especially? That's a big thing for, you know, Vietnamese people, where you go for education, right?
Yeah. Well, you know, I coped with the loneliness of that lifestyle I just described, because my parents were always away working, and then my brother was 7 years older. So by the time I was 10 or 11, he was off to college. So I had a very lonely childhood. This is when you can, you know, play the violins. And the way I coped with it was to read a lot. So, you know, look at my office now, it's full of books. We had no books in our house. I have no idea why. I mean, like, my parents were devout Catholics. We didn't have a Bible. We had no books. And so I didn't have any money to buy books. My parents never would have bought me books. So I went to the library a lot, the San Jose Public Library, especially the main branch, which I think is no longer there. But that was my second home, you know, where I would go every weekend with a backpack, fill it full of books. And by the next weekend, I'd have read all those books and go back for more books. So it was really, you know, literature was really a life-saving experience for me. And I got it in my head that maybe I could write some stories. So in the third grade, I was enrolled at a public school. You know, we all got a chance to write and draw our own books. So I did one. It was called Lester the Cat. And it's about Lester, who's a city cat. And I guess my personality was already evident in third grade, because this is a story about urban ennui and alienation. Because Lester the cat just, you know, is fed up with urban life, so he runs off to the countryside and finds love with a country cat. I'm pretty sure it was a heterosexual affair. I don't know if I ever specified. I think I said it was a girl cat. You know, just all the other possibilities were beyond my imagination. So the San Jose Public Library gave my book an award and set me off on the road to 40 years of misery trying to become a writer. So I'm very thankful to the San Jose Public Library for giving me the illusion that I could be a writer and not preparing me in any way for the soul-wrenching dilemmas and work required to be a writer. As for my parents, you know, of course, they didn't care what I was doing. I mean, all they cared about was that they fed me, gave me religion, gave me an education. They never asked about my grades unless I got a bad grade. Then they wanted to learn about it. Otherwise, the expectation was you're going to do well. And so my brother fulfilled all those expectations. He came when he was 7 from Vietnam, didn't speak any English. Well, 10 years later, he graduated from San Jose High, which I think was probably the worst high school in the city, and as valedictorian of his class, and went to Harvard. Me, 7 years younger, we had a little bit more money. My parents sent me to private school, including the most elite high school in San Jose, Bellarmine. And what happened? I was rejected from every college that I applied to, all the Ivy Leagues, all the UC campuses, except for one. So everybody was pretty much disgusted with me. I went off to become an English major at this last choice university. And what I followed my brother's advice. My brother was a philosophy major and pre-med at Harvard, and he wanted to become a doctor. So he said, why don't you do the same things? I was an English major and I was pre-med. I lasted in pre-med for 11 weeks. And the first week of the second quarter of honors chemistry, I just walked out of the classroom. I was like, I've had enough, you know? And then I lied to my parents and I said, with my English major, I'm gonna become a lawyer. And that kept them off my back for the next 3 years. And then when it came time to go to graduate school, I decided to become an English professor. And I told my parents, I'm gonna go to get a doctorate in English. That's very confusing for them. I think they understood the doctorate part, but not the English part. So they focused on the doctorate part, which sounded like the doctorate my brother got. And they left me alone for a few years, expecting, though, that I would get a job. But I never told them that I wanted to be a writer. That would just be going way too far. But at least with a doctorate as a professor, they could at least get their minds around that there would be a job there. But writer, no way.
I'm glad it's so opposite. I am also an English major, and I told my parents I want to be a writer, and I think that was where they gave up on me. So,
Right.
but gratefully, it led me to other things that they can respect now. So, um, I'm glad to hear that they were been so supportive, because that's not often the case. However, with the contingency that you get good grades, so that makes sense. You know, so as long as you're not messing up in that department, that made sense for you to do whatever you wish. But did you, during this time, you know, even with, you know, that early taste of writing success from the San Jose Public Library, did anybody influence you or mentor you during this, you know, moment? Because it's not like we, you know, I think I didn't have a lot of mentors. I grew up on the hip hop generation, so a lot of my writing mentors were rappers, you know. But for you, you know, during your youth and into your young adulthood, did you have those mentors or people who kind of ushered you in a great place?
You know, when I got that award from the San Jose Public Library, the award was given on a weekend. My parents couldn't take time out of their day to take me to the library to get my award. So actually, the librarian at my public school, Lowell Elementary in San Jose, she came to pick me up from our house, take me to the library, treated me to a burger at the fancy hotel across the street. Never forgotten that, and I still remember her face, but unfortunately, I've forgotten her name. So that was, you know, that was a mentor, someone who was very kind and who fulfilled, you know, went above and beyond what she had to do, but did what she should do, which is obviously to give a hand up to this poor refugee kid. I didn't have mentors outside of the mentors we should normally get, like teachers who were supportive and, you know, who indulged my reading habits or who said something positive about the various kinds of writings that I was trying to experiment with in high school. So I think just in general, I was lucky to be put on an educational track by my parents through Catholic school, where the level of education was high. So that I was getting to read stuff that other kids probably weren't getting to read. So by the time I went to high school, you know, I went to Bellarmine, and I took seminars on James Joyce and William Faulkner when I was a teenager. I mean, the expectations were really high that we could read these kinds of things. And I think that's always left an impression on me in my own career as a writer, that I want to aim high too. I want to be in conversation with some of the people that I had to read and respected because of the quality of their literary accomplishments.
Was there a big, you know, need to, as a Vietnamese American, you know, also, you know, project yourself in a way that you have the community be proud of you, or for yourself to, you know, break the stereotype of our, you know, our diaspora, that we don't write great works, you know?
Well, I don't know that I ever felt that anybody understood me in the Vietnamese American community. You know, like when I was an early example of a banana. I was a very early banana. So in the 1970s and 1980s, you know, people had just come from Vietnam. So even the kids, for the most part, spoke Vietnamese. Okay. But I, for whatever, so the peculiar circumstances of my family is that I come from a Catholic family. And typically, Catholic families have like 8, 10, a dozen kids, right? My parents only had 2. So when you have 8, 10, or a dozen kids, you can probably have a chance to speak Vietnamese at home and all that. I didn't. So my Vietnamese stayed at basically 4-year-old fluent Vietnamese for quite a long time. And I was not hanging out with a lot of other Vietnamese people outside of my cousins. I was the one going to the library, completely immersing myself in English. And I feel like I probably made some kind of subconscious decision at a very young age that I had to choose. You know, I had to choose Vietnamese or English, because I could see in the Vietnamese American community that most of the kids were choosing sort of like Vietnamese, you know, and that's important. But I felt very American. I also felt very Vietnamese, but I also felt very American. My future was in the United States. I didn't, you know, articulate this explicitly, but I think I felt it. And so I think I committed myself to English. Like there's only room for one language in my head. And I wanted to be really good at this language, because I thought my fight was going to be here in the United States, not in Vietnam. And it's a kind of a regrettable decision in some ways. I mean, there's pluses and minuses. And the minuses are that even to this day, my Vietnamese is still kind of not that great. It's better than a lot of other Vietnamese Americans, but it's not fluent by any means. And it means that, you know, I can't communicate with my dad very well in his old age. And so I have regrets about that. about that. But I did feel intuitively that I loved literature, that English was something I had to master, and that when I was a little bit older, by the time I was in high school and college, I knew that literature was where I was going to try to make my mark, as an individual, but maybe also as a writer. And so I had to be better at English. And if I wanted to be a writer, I think that I had to be better than most other people. Because obviously we who are Asian Americans obviously know that part of the stereotypes about us are that we're not good at English and all that kind of thing. And that is not our language. And, part of this whole anti-Asian hate thing that we're going through right now is related to this idea that Asians and Asian Americans are foreigners to this country, culturally, but also linguistically. And so my reaction to that was not to continue in my whitewashed way. It was for me, it was like, I see literature as a way of fighting back against this kind of thing. And that what would be important would be both the content of what I wrote in terms of who would be in the stories, but how I wrote, like the language itself. And that I didn't want to be a second-class American writer. I didn't want to be, I have no problem with being called a Vietnamese or Asian American writer, but I'm also a writer. All these things are true, and I felt that my own way of contributing to our Vietnamese American community and the Asian American population was to do the best that I could as a writer. And again, not just in the content, but in the language and the form, that I would be uncontestably an American writer as good as every other American writer. And that in itself would be important for us as Vietnamese people, even if honestly, most Vietnamese people don't care. Like they couldn't care less about whether or not we have a Vietnamese American literature or a Vietnamese American writer. But I think they're wrong. I think that in fact we do need these writers and these storytellers, that when it comes to something like the politics of the day that we're facing and anti-Asian hate and all that kind of thing, it's great to have doctors and lawyers and engineers. Those are all noble professions, but they're not going to save us. Mm-hmm. They're not going to save us. And it's up to our storytellers, our activists, and our politicians to do that kind of work.
I'm glad you said it. I said you said it. However, we all need those people too.
We need them.
We need them.
If I have a medical emergency, I'm not going to go see a writer. I'm going to go see my doctor, brother. Yeah, we need them.
I'm glad you echo that, because as a writer myself, it's hard to articulate this to our family or the older generation, because right now, not to say there is a renaissance, but I do see so many more Southeast Asian writers come up, especially more Vietnamese writers. When I was writing, I only saw Bao Phi or older previous generation of Vietnamese writers, poets, and authors. But Bao was like the closest person, and we're affiliated with Bao. It's like he was the closest one I related to, because he was trying to take language in a dynamic form. Being a Vietnamese American in Minneapolis, he was so loud. It was unnerving for a person that wanted to be on that level, but he just took it to another level. It was like he's not afraid, and that's something that at parts I feel like, why do we have to prove that we understand this language or speak or can write in this way? But because we're not there yet, we do have to, in some ways, master that and show the world, hey, we can kill it too, So.
Well, I think all writers have to prove themselves. It's not just us or whatever writers of color or Asian American writers. All writers have to prove themselves. I mean, everybody who publishes a book of whatever is going to be judged very harshly on how good of a writer that they are. So we're all judged in that way. But there's no doubt that those of us who are writers of color, including Asian Americans, have a second level of judgment involved. And there's just no denying it. I mean, when we talk about race in this country, it's sort of an unavoidable topic. We don't get to choose. We don't get to choose. I mean, maybe we want to live in some kind of ideal world where we can be colorblind and we don't have to acknowledge these kinds of things. But I think that the racial divisions and inequalities and misconceptions that are endemic throughout our society are present in the world of literature and culture as well. So it would be foolish not to acknowledge that there is something to be proven, both at the level of the literature, but also at the level of people's expectations. And we shouldn't have to prove, like you're saying. And in some circumstances, we don't prove. Like, for example, I think for a certain generation of immigrant, refugee, foreign, minority writers and writers of color, there may be the idea that when we write, we're trying to prove our humanity. Now that we should not do. That we should not do. Because people who are a part of a majority, whether it's a racial majority, sexual majority, whatever, they never have to prove their humanity. They take it for granted. They never question their humanity. That's part of the privilege of being a part of the majority. When you're a minority, you know you're human, but your humanity is also being questioned all the time through majority cultures, misrepresentations and distortions of you and your people and all that kind of thing. So there may be a temptation to want to prove humanity. That is wrong. Mm-hmm. So we never should prove our humanity. We should always take our humanity for granted and go from there. But there's other, I think, demands of proof that are more valid that we need to struggle with.
All right. And thank you for that. I'm just going to pivot, into the writing and also the novels as well. How much of, especially your fiction, is coming from personal experience? Because even with The Committed, now you're not. You did took some trips to the France and to write. I remember going on your Instagram and I was like, "Oh, this guy's in France for a while." And how important is that for you to pull from your own personal experience or personal experiences if you were able to do some field research to make your stories pop or come to life?
Well, they're not autobiographical for the most part, because
all right, there you go. Right.
Well, honestly, I've had a very boring life for the most part. It's like, who wants to hear about Viet's life? That was my thinking for most of my life as a writer. Like, my parents' lives were interesting. They lived through all kinds of, dramatic history in Vietnam, through war and famine and colonization and refugee experience and all of that. I was just a beneficiary. I didn't make any choices in this regard. I was just carried over by my parents as a refugee as a kid. So I was not that interested in writing about myself. And of course, there's also, when we get back to the question of judgment, there's been this perception of especially of Asian American writers, that they only write autobiographically. Like that's all they have. Like, oh, your terrible, immigrant convenience store experience. That's what you got to write about. Oh, your war. That's what you got to write about. And so it was very, conscious on my part not to write autobiographically. And so in The Sympathizer, for example, the protagonist, and this carries over into The Committed, is an alcoholic. He's a womanizer. He's a spy. He's a liar. He's a traitor. He's a murderer. So definitely not autobiographical, or so I like to tell you, except for maybe the alcoholism part. All right. I drink a lot. So that was a very deliberate thing, to create a persona so far removed from me that no one could mistake the sympathizer for Viet. But ironically, I did put personal experience in there, the seed of a personal experience, which is that when I was growing up in San Jose, I felt in my parents' very Vietnamese household that I was an American spying on them. And then when I stepped out into the rest of the American world, I felt like I was a Vietnamese spying on Americans. And I think that's actually a very common experience for immigrants and for refugees, for outsiders. Obviously W.E.B. Du Bois in The Souls of Black Folk already said in 1903 that Black people always see themselves through their own eyes and the eyes of others. And that insight is applicable to so many other populations. And, Chang Rae Lee, a native speaker, took that idea and did it in that novel for Korean Americans. And I took that idea and I did it for The Sympathizer, except I put that idea into the body of a real spy who has a much more dramatic and exciting life. And I put him under much more extreme circumstances than I've had. But a lot of my personal experience in terms of my knowledge of the Vietnamese refugee experience and Vietnam and its history and the war are present in The Sympathizer. That was my obsession when I was growing up. And so I didn't have to do a lot of research in one way for The Sympathizer because I had been thinking about it for decades. With The Committed, as you said, it's set in Paris. And I've been to Paris several times before the novel, but, obviously why not go to Paris again for the sake of research? And what I did when I went there was my primary goal was to talk to a lot of French people of Vietnamese descent and see what their life was like. Because I think their experiences are quite different than that of Vietnamese Americans. And partly because France is not allergic to communism, unlike the way America is. I mean, the United States is a deeply anti-communist country, and that fits perfectly well with Vietnamese refugees who are anti-communist. In France, it's a much more different picture where there's more openness around these political issues and where the Vietnamese community is more politically diverse. I mean, Vietnamese people have been going to France since the early 20th century. Some of them are very French, and some of them are quite leftist. And then you have the refugee generation that came in 75 and afterwards, and they, of course, tend to be anti-communist. So I wanted to see what that was like, and also what, you know, the French culture was like around these questions of race and colonialism versus the United States. And the differences are pretty striking, and that's partly what the Committed deals with. And then lastly, for the Refugees, which is a short story collection, you know, there's only one autobiographical short story in that collection. It's a collection about, you know, Vietnamese refugees and the people who love them. But I never wanted to write autobiographically until then. In the collection, I wrote that one story about the grocery store on Santa Clara Street in downtown San Jose, inspired by a real life incident where this woman, according to my mom, came to the store and was raising money for the anti-communist cause. You know, that in the 80s, there really were, you know, these Vietnamese refugees who felt that they could stage an armed counterattack on Vietnam. And I saw their pictures. They were training in the Thai jungle and everything. So this woman came and asked for money. I think my mother felt like it was kind of an extortion, and you know, pay up or, you know, you're a communist. And so that made its way into the story. So ironically, that story, the Refugees is translated and published in Vietnam. That story was censored in Vietnam. So, you know, the one autobiographical short story I ever wrote cannot be read in Vietnamese, at least in Vietnam. So I feel, you know, pained about that.
It's okay, because I was going to lead into the question that talks about that as well. But now that as you said, it's not autobiographical, but also, you know, the characters, you know, feel so real, or they could be allegories. So I'm going to answer two questions that the people ask, but combine them to one. So the brothership, you know, the fellowship of bond man and our protagonist, the man of two minds, where did you pull these three out of? You know, do they represent something, whether an idea or part of something of the diaspora that represents who they are? Because I can see distinctly, you know, especially Bond, Man, and our protagonist, especially the man of two minds, you can see both sides. But Man and Bond, I see in my uncles, my parents, my family, or the ideals of whether it be the South or the North, you know? So where did they come from, you know?
Well, you know, it's very interesting that you bring up the North and the South, because obviously, you know, our history has been defined by this political conflict between the North and the South since 1945. And I wanted to avoid that easy binary, you know, of just having two characters, for example, representing these political differences, because obviously our own history has been so deeply divided on that question, not just of North and South, but communism and anti-communism. And we just go round and round on this binaristic division. So I wanted to make sure that we had a third character. So that would be a triptych. And of course, that represents a different kind of, you know, representation of Vietnam, that Vietnam is also often talked about as North, Center, and South as well. But with three characters, I felt that I could both depict the sort of the binaristic divisions within the community and within Vietnam, and then also have a third character that would be the mediating figure. And that's exactly what the sympathizer as a narrator represents. He's a man of two faces and two minds. He sees every issue from both sides, but he can't really, he's always struggling about the choice that he's making. And so, you know, to throw in a fancy word, I thought of the sympathizer as a dialectical novel. You know, this was an idea that, you know, one of my high school teachers put in my mind when I was in high school. Here's the dialectic, and there's a thesis and the antithesis and the synthesis. And, you know, there's also Marxist dialectic as well. So that's what the sympathizer as a novel is supposed to perform, is not, you know, simply depicting war as conflict, but depicting the process of trying to negotiate, doing this dialectic, struggling with ideological choices and personal choices in a way that never stops. So the dialectic never stops moving. And so The Committed is part of a trilogy. I mean, Sympathizer, The Committed, then the third novel that I've yet to write, because then these three novels themselves form a dialectical trilogy. You know, we've worked through in The Sympathizer the war in Vietnam and its immediate consequences. In The Committed, and it's focused on the United States and Vietnam. In The Committed, it's focused on the United States and France. And it's dialectical in the sense of, we have to talk about French colonialism because the French got off easy. Honestly, the French got off easy in terms of what they did to Vietnam. But the Committed as a sequel, focusing on a character, is about his descent even further into hell. Like he's been destroyed, and he has to rebuild himself in the Committed. So it's that kind of a novel. And then finally, the third novel, he has to come back to the United States, the final movement of the dialectic for him, as he's now rebuilding himself. He's trying to ask in the third novel, well, what does a revolutionary commitment to social justice look like if it's not about communism and it's not about capitalism? What else is left for us? And so that to me is a really important question. As someone who always felt these issues of social and economic justice and their relationship to art very, very intimately. And also as someone who, was raised a Catholic, as I am. And as a Catholic, you're all about supposedly justice. I mean, in my mind, Jesus Christ is nothing but a revolutionary activist, who got martyred for what he believed in. And then he's been turned into this other symbol by the Catholic Church and the Vietnamese Catholic Church, which I completely object to. But I stopped being a Catholic a long, long time ago, but I think I've retained that very Catholic sense of the necessity for sacrifice, for martyrdom, and for this utopian notion of an afterlife of justice. And so the final novel is going to try to figure that question out.
It's interesting because it does answer one of the questions I had, was the growth of these characters, because now that I know it's going to be a trilogy, and if anything in those sections, when you have a trilogy, it's about growth. So the Sympathizer, it's idealism of what you believe and what you thought you knew, but the Sympathizer can see both sides. But however, in the Committed, granted, no ways, have finished it or finished it already, I don't give away too much. He becomes a drug dealer.
I just want to say that on Twitter, someone said in their tweet response to that novel, every Vietnamese drug dealer should read this novel, which I think is the greatest blurb ever, and yes, so if you're a drug dealer out there and you want some tips, go read the novel.
It's strange because he gets a taste of capitalism, or the idea that if he lost everything, so why not just be what I want to be, or whatever's in front of me. And it was such a strange thing because he still can see every side. He sees every side. And it comes so crazy because most of the book is him talking to himself.
He's crazy, right?
He's crazy.
I mean, he's a little bit crazy. So there is that.
But go on.
I mean, so he makes a very bad choice. And the very bad choice is not to become a drug dealer. The very bad choice is to become a capitalist, as he puts it. Mm-hmm. And I don't think I'm being polemical here. Because look at where we're at now. I mean, the biggest drug dealers in this country, not the guy down the street, not the guy you're calling for your dime bag or whatever. The biggest drug dealers in this country is the Sackler family. They made billions of dollars selling opioids to the American people and killing and addicting tens of thousands of people in the name of capitalism and financial profit. And they get to put their name all over these museums, et cetera, and literally whitewashing, laundering their bloody profits. That's capitalism, right? And so that's part of the point that the novel is making. Yes, he's got involved in drug dealing, but he's selling small quantities of hashish and something called the remedy to the elite white French people and to the Bohemian Vietnamese French people of Vietnamese descent. That's just recreation. That's just a hobby money. That's nothing compared to state-run and corporate-run billion-dollar drug enterprises. And in the novel, part of the point that's brought up is that the French state, were drug dealers, right? In Indochina. Like the French financed their Indo-Chinese empire by cultivating the growth of opium in Laos, converting that into, and then forcing the people of Indochina to buy and use opium. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That is worse than anything that a Vietnamese drug dealer could ever do.
And I mean, granted, I judged him harshly in this book, but however, I'm like, he got to make a living. I mean, you know, the restaurant scene. You have a couple amazing scenes in this book, like also the Sympathizer, that which I'll allude to when they create the TV show with A24. It's, you know, Park Chan-wook's gonna make some amazing scenes. You're a great visualizer of things, especially the bathroom scenes. I was pretty entertained as well as inspired to see how that plays out, especially with his monologues himself. I want to see how they play that out, but you know, granted, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Now, let's talk about these. Now that the books are out into the public, I always wanted to know the response, because one of the big things is you said the Refugees was translated in Vietnam, but you know, of course, you know, censored one of the stories. I don't know when has the, you know, either one of these books been translated in Vietnam. Have you even gone back to even speak about your novels in the country?
The last time I was in Vietnam was 2014, and I was finishing the Sympathizer when I was writing that in Hanoi. And I haven't been back. I was back for one day in 2016 when my son turned 1, and we flew from Singapore to Saigon just so he could spend his first birthday with his aunt in Saigon. But I haven't been back since. And I haven't been back since because I think I said to myself, unless they translate and publish the Sympathizer in Vietnamese, why would I go back to Vietnam anymore? The one exception I would make is if they film the Sympathizer in Vietnam, then I'm like, of course I'm going to go, because I want to hang out with the crew and do all kinds of, you know, Vietnamese hijinks in Vietnam. We're pretty good at partying, so why not? But you know, I have a Vietnamese publisher for the Sympathizer. There is a translation, but we can't get government permission to publish the book. It's a very, very complicated and sensitive process. I don't want to say anything more. I don't want to jeopardize what chances we have of publishing the book. So what I hear is that there are Vietnamese people who have read the book in English in Vietnam, and that there is, you know, enthusiasm for it, I guess, especially among the younger generation. But if you can read English in Vietnam, especially at the level of English required to read the Sympathizer, you already have a very different kind of a class than many Vietnamese people. So I think that there is, at this time, in Vietnam, a highly educated intelligentsia who are also exposed to the outside world, whether it's Western influences or other influences. Many of them have gone to foreign countries like the United States to study. They've seen something outside of Vietnamese political system. And so maybe they're open as a result of all that exposure to what the Sympathizer itself does. As for Vietnamese Americans, I have a complicated relationship with the Vietnamese American community, going back to my whitewashing origins, right? So if you know anything about the Vietnamese American community, you know that it's dominated historically by anti-communism. And so when I wrote the Sympathizer, I made a very conscious decision to write it from the perspective of a communist spy, even though I knew that what that meant is that a substantial portion of the Vietnamese American community would never read the novel, simply because they would reject any possibility of expressing any empathy for a Vietnamese communist. It's simply unacceptable. And yet the point of that novel is about the need to transcend our own resentments and our own worldviews, and to be able to empathize with people who are our opposites and even our enemies. And that was the reason why I wanted to make him a Vietnamese communist. It would have been too easy and too expected to make him a Southern Vietnamese soldier, for example. And I wanted to write a novel that would challenge Vietnamese audiences. I think that, part of the discourse around literature, for example, or storytelling, especially for those of us who come from minoritized communities of some kind or another, is that we should be telling stories that affirm our community. I mean, that's important, right? But that's not the only thing we should be doing. We expect our storytellers in the larger context, let's just say the United States, we expect our storytellers not just to affirm American culture, but to criticize American culture, to engage with American culture, to show American culture in all of its complexities, its virtues and its vices, its successes and its failures. And, I felt that was my task. I feel that is our task as, Vietnamese American or Asian American writers or writers of color or whatever. It's not simply to affirm. It's sometimes to directly challenge some of the most deeply held notions of our people and our communities. And so that's partly what the Sympathizer and the Committed try to do.
Thank you for that. Definitely answers, where it is at in Vietnam. So I hope that things, I hope it gets into the right hands or heads and gets released. But what about the French? Because I know with the committee, you tackled the French colonialism. So what is the response with, this book with the people in France?
I don't know. I mean, the French actually liked the Sympathizer quite a bit. They gave it a couple of book awards in after it was translated into French, and it's done well. And I've had good press coverage there. And there was some criticism of French colonialism in that novel, but that was in the background. Of course, the father of the Sympathizer is a French priest who molests a young Vietnamese girl. But I think that the criticisms of the French in the Sympathizer are around French colonialism, French colonization. And the French are smart enough to know that they shouldn't be defending French colonization too strong, right? Yeah, we did some wrong things. We did some bad things in Africa and Asia. We got to admit it, okay? But in the Committed, it's a much more stringent critique of French colonialism. And it's also set in Paris of the early 1980s. So there's a direct take on the way by which French colonialism has continued into the present, so that the French are still benefiting from the profits of colonization. And there's a critique of the French notions of, democracy, universalism, race, or the denial of race in France. So it's the novel, I think, takes on some topics that the French are debating very vigorously right now. So I don't know what the French reaction is going to be, honestly. We'll see how tolerant they are of an outsider and a formerly colonized person to come in and talk to them about their own society.
But you, in some very clever ways, some of the characters, and I love that you don't ever, except some important characters that the protagonist cares about, they get their full names. Everybody else gets a nickname, that identifies them. You got the Maoist PhD. I think it's him. That it's funny because he acts like a revolutionary. He talks about revolution, of communism or socialism, and that he has been, in fact, involved in it, but once and in a very subtle way. And it almost speaks to, people who talk about being activists for other people's causes, but, join one march or one event and like, yeah, I was there. I was fighting for you all. But it's like, it makes me think of all those people who, you weren't there because you're not 100% invested or you don't look like me. So I love the critique that happens with characters that I laugh about when I'm reading them in the book. But then they're fallible like anybody else, and it speaks to what's going on even now, how people think of solidarity, right? So it's a fun book, especially that if you didn't read The Sympathizer, this could be a standalone in itself with some allusions to the previous book, but it moves so fast and in such an exciting way. So have you always wanted to write the spy novel and a novel because these are your first books in fiction form? At the fact that you made a sequel, I was like, wow, he didn't choose to go to a different route. He just went, I'm gonna keep going with this.
Well, it's called making money. So sequels, why not? Well, I one of the things that I was doing when I was in the San Jose Public Library at a young age, was reading everything I get my hands on, which would include like all kinds of so-called genre fiction. So I never made a distinction between so-called literary fiction and so-called genre fiction. And I made the transition very easily from, children's literature to the young adult section to the adult section. And so I read a lot of fantasy and science fiction and also spy stories, detective stories, that kind of thing. So I was reading, for example, by the time I was in high school, like Graham Greene. I didn't read The Quiet American, but I read a bunch of other Graham Greene novels. And so there was always in the sense of my mind that I enjoy novels with plots. And I think novels can be entertaining and tackle serious issues at the same time. And that's one thing that the spy novel, and then for the Committed, the crime novel, that's one thing that the spy and the crime novels allow, is to bring together exciting plots with social, political, historical topics. Because when you read detective and crime and spy stories, what's very noticeable is that these writers are very willing to engage with these political and historical issues, much more so than a lot of so-called literary writers. here in the United States, the so-called literary writers tend to write about domestic issues and cancer and weddings and, or, adultery, all that kind of thing, which is fine. But why not write about war and communism and all that kind of stuff? So, I think I've always been, I like to think of myself as a refugee who's always been very vulgar. Like I got a very elite education and everything, but part of me is very vulgar because Vietnamese people are vulgar. At least the Vietnamese people I've known, not necessarily my own family, but you venture out, you go to the market, you go to the restaurants, and people are kind of crass in the way that they talk and their values and all this kind of thing.
Folly habits,
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. So I like to bring the high and the low together. The only thing I'm not interested in is the middle. But The Sympathizer and The Committed are definitely novels that are both very, very serious and high-minded about ideas, and then also very low in terms of their commitment to not just plot, but vulgar things like sex and violence and bathroom humor. I'm very proud of my capacity to tell really, really puerile jokes.
You're good. You're very good, man. Yeah. Now, before we just close out, I just want to now just talk about how happy are you that this is picked up now by probably one of the most prestigious, companies that produces some and puts out some amazing content. A24. That this is going to be a TV show. It's going to be a TV show.
Well, we hope so. Basically, when I wrote The Sympathizer, I watched a lot of TV. Like I had not watched TV for a decade before writing The Sympathizer, and then I had 2 years off, so I had all this time. So I watched all the, the classics that had come out, like Mad Men, The Wire, The Sopranos. And so The Sympathizer is actually structured very deliberately as a lot of episodes, and so I think it's very easily adaptable to television. But it was a long road, to get from, winning the Pulitzer Prize in 2016 when people started to pay attention to the book to now. And I think that there's complicated reasons why. I think it's probably a difficult novel to adapt, not formally, but because of the politics of the novel. It's a novel that's very, critical of the United States and of Americans, and maybe a lot of Americans don't know quite how to handle that kind of a perspective. But it's also a novel that's centered wholly on Vietnamese people and very specifically on a mixed race protagonist. He's French and Vietnamese. And so Hollywood, I think, doesn't know what to do with that kind of stuff. I mean, it's making the right noises now out of guilt. It's like, oh my God, we're so sorry for all our anti-Asian racism from the past century. So let's try to support Asian American narratives at this point. But that wasn't the case in 2016. And so we had a hard time trying to sell this novel to people. But I think things have changed slightly. And I think also once we got Park Chan-wook involved, things really changed. Because I tell you something, in Hollywood, a writer is still just a writer, which is to say almost a nobody. So I'm almost a nobody with a Pulitzer, which means people don't really care that much. But, when we got Park Chan-wook to come to meetings, then that was when all the real excitement got started, for very good reasons, because Park Chan-wook's an amazing director, and his movie The Old Boy was actually a big influence on The Sympathizer in terms of its energy and its I don't know, eccentricity or weirdness or however you want to characterize it. So I think that was the right marriage and a right partnership for the book to have him on board. I think he's sort of ideal. Also because he's not an American. I think Americans would totally screw me on this. And in fact, the producer who initially optioned it is Canadian, right? And then A24, who then optioned that option, is well known for doing sort of things that question normative American assumptions. And then we bring in Park Chan-wook as someone who's Korean, an international auteur. And it was really great to talk to him. He came to my house, and then we had dinner a couple of times and everything.
Sorry, my bad.
Yeah, and at one dinner, Sandra Oh stopped by. I was like, okay, Sandra Oh's here. I'm sitting next to Sandra Oh. And Sandra Oh, at one point in dinner, turned to me and said, so, what's your process? I was like, I could die right there. Sandra Oh asked me about my process. But he actually read the novel, and he was so engaged with it that the questions he asked, I thought, why were you not here when I was writing the novel? Because if I'd answered these questions about the plot and whatever else, this would have been a better novel. So I think that I'm really excited about that, his level of engagement. And we're still a few steps away from making it into a TV series because it's very, very complicated. And So we've optioned it, but you still have to at this point sell it to somebody, some studio that will actually give you the money to make this into a TV show. So that's the next big step that we have to make.
I'll say this with I think in the recent decade, which watching television shows like Lovecraft Country, even Atlanta, and which tackle complex issues on racism, and identity in America. I think hopefully the right people will see it, but if we eschew it, and if they don't, we pass up on this great opportunity. But I already know it's going to be great television once, if and when it gets made. One question from the audience. Just so that before we wrap it up, is Bon and Man Vietnamese people you knew, the names itself, or these folks that you kind of composited together to create?
Oh, I think they're completely fictional characters, but I think that they are inspired by traits that I've seen in Vietnamese people, especially Vietnamese men, like the heavy drinking, the male bonding, socializing. Like Vietnamese men are very romantic, as the sympathizer points out. But as soon as they get married, they're like, romance is over. Sorry, babe. You go have your kids, and I'm gonna go hang out at the pool hall or the cafe with my buds. And that's the kind of masculinity that these guys represent. So it's a kind of masculinity that I'm very familiar with, even though I'm not masculine myself very much. But I've watched these guys from a respectable distance, because you don't want to get too close. They smoke a lot, and they could be very dangerous if they're young. All right, that was my perception growing up in San Jose. Don't make eye contact with a group of Vietnamese guys. So I was always aware of this masculinity, this romantic masculinity, homosocial bonding, and the potential for violence, and the sense that this brotherhood was something that these men would die for. Whether they did or not, I have no idea. But that was sort of the rhetoric, like we're brothers to the end. And I think that is my perception of Vietnamese masculinity and how it intersects with the world of war and revolution. Because what happens when these loyalties are intersecting or contradict with political loyalties? And this is something that really happened in Vietnam, that people in the same family, for example, would choose different sides during the war. And so what would you do if these two loyalties were put into question? And so I think there have been stories of Vietnamese people who deliberately helped their cousins or siblings or friends or whatever, who they knew to be the enemy, but they put the family or the friendship loyalty first in that regard. I think it's very Vietnamese. Maybe it's very human, but I think that I've heard plenty of stories like that. And so these three guys exemplify that complexity of contradictory love and loyalty to friends and to ideologies, which is part of the tragedy of the country, which the novel wanted to explore, both at the very abstract level, but also at this very personal level of these three characters.
Definitely for those out there, which it kind of shows itself in the committed from the beginning to the end. So I definitely ask people to read that. It reflects how complex the relationships can be, but it makes sense as well. Before we end, any words of wisdom that you can give to us? Any kind of call to actions? Any shout outs?
Well, I mean, this is a librarians podcast, so shout out to all the librarians and the great work you're doing out there. I think that, like being a librarian is sort of like being a teacher, like you impact people and you never oftentimes know how that's the case. But, I can remember vividly the faces of the librarians that I encountered in the San Jose Public Library who were just doing their job, but their job had a big impact on someone like me. So big shout out to the teachers and the librarians who are shaping young lives out there. I think you don't know what's going to happen in 20 or 30 years with these young people and what they can become. That's really, really valuable. And I mean, the call to action is simply that we need to support our libraries. We need to support our educational system. Like I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for that moment where the school decided to have a writing exercise, and the librarian took me to the public library to get my award. I I just think that's such important work uh, for every young person, but then also especially for immigrants and for refugees. I mean, it was literally a life-saving and life-transforming experience. What happened to me at that young age. So keep it up. Keep up the
Thank you
good
so
work.
much. And Chicken to See, maybe it's time to revisit that, story you made in third grade. I think it might be a hit. So
My ex-girlfriend has it. I'm not sure where to
ah
it again. All
ah
right.
all
Well,
right. She kind of has the rights. Oh well, hey, you're a writer. You can write another one. Um, Other than that, Viet, thank you for everything. Thank you for we only met in the last 5 years or so, but Devon, Pivot, with your brother, for me, finding community and looking for community that not only just looks like me, but speaks like me and wishes more for all of us. It's been a great pleasure to work with you, as well as befriend you and see you grow as somebody I can say, hey, maybe someday that could be me or not. Who knows? But I'm here to support you, brother. That's it.
thanks so much, Danny. Thanks to everybody out there for watching.
Thank you,
See you soon, Sam.
everybody. Everybody take care. Have a good weekend. And we'll catch you in the flip. Peace.